You're watching Middle East Matters here on France 24 with me, Haxie Meyers-Belkin. This week, a Syrian official revealed that the Al-Hol camp, housing thousands of people with suspected links to the Islamic State group, had witnessed mass escape in the weeks since government forces took control of it on the 21st of January. At least 133 breaches were discovered, with most escapees taking advantage of the chaos during clashes between the Kurdish fighters who had been controlling it. Lisa Kaminoff reports.
Deserted tents and scattered belongings are all that remain at the Al-Hol camp in northeastern Syria. The government confirmed a mass prisoner escape with hundreds of relatives of Islamic State jihadists on the run. According to several witnesses, the camp had been left unguarded, with over 138 breaches discovered in the camp's 17-kilometer perimeter wall.
For about 3 hours, there was absolutely no security presence at the camp. They were on their own, so whoever wanted to leave left, and whoever wanted to stay stayed. There was complete freedom in the camp.
Al-Hol camp was long run by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, but they had to withdraw when the new Syrian government forces seized it in late January.
The SDF withdrew suddenly, without coordination and without prior notification to the Ministry of the Interior or the International Anti-Jihadist Coalition.
After the defeat of the Islamic State group in 2019, the camp had 73,000 people, most of them Syrian and Iraqi, but the number has since declined, leaving around 23,500 people. 70% of them were women, children and the elderly. After the Kurdish forces' withdrawal, thousands of them ran away. Their current location remains unknown, as Syrian authorities have not yet released information. This comes as the United States announces the transfer of jihadist detainees from Syria to Iraq to ensure they remain under surveillance.
As you heard there, fighting between Syrian government forces and Kurdish fighters stopped after a ceasefire was reached last month, a ceasefire that lays a framework for integrating Kurdish forces into the Syrian state and which has sprawling implications for aspirations of Kurdish autonomy in northeast Syria. Pauline Godard, Amar Al-Hamidawi and Dida Faridoun report.
On January 30th, everything changed for Syrian Kurds. Their authorities signed an agreement with President Mohammed al-Sharaa, but many Kurds have not forgotten his jihadist past. The agreement meant that Damascus took back control of the northeast of the country.
Rojava's learned. We got used to living with our own culture. We've lived in a so-called democracy, if you like. They're nothing but radicals, terrorists, Islamists. Everyone was more accustomed to seeing them in jihadist getup, but all they've done is change their outfits.
Taha says he'll never be able to trust them.
I can't imagine going out in the street tomorrow and finding myself surrounded by hooded people, seeing just their eyes, and having them tell me they're police officers, or seeing my sister, my wife, my daughter forced to wear the niqab. There's no way I could stand that.
At this center, aid has arrived from Iraqi Kurdistan. Here, displaced people can collect food and warm clothes. Nearly half of the 40,000 people who fled the fighting have found refuge in Qamishli. The town's now the de facto capital of what remains of Syrian Kurdistan. Hawa is from Kobane, a predominantly Kurdish city on the border between Turkey and Syria. She's not been able to return home for years. Hawa's already been forced to flee 3 times in the last decade.
We were afraid of being killed. That's why we left. The first time, we fled to Turkey, when ISIS arrived. And then we went to Raqqa, and from Raqqa to here, Qamishli.
In the streets of Qamishli, residents are mindful that the agreement with the government is fragile. In the outskirts of the city, Kurdish female fighters remain vigilant on the border with areas controlled by Damascus. Rohilat Afrin is their commander-in-chief. For her, the deal's an imperfect but necessary solution.
The purpose of this agreement was to stop the bloodshed and to preserve the gains that us Kurds have achieved. The Kurds are still here. They've not been wiped off the map. When we concluded this agreement, we understood that apart from the Kurdish forces, no one could protect us. Kurdish unity is the greatest victory in the conquest of Kurdish rights. That's how we see reality. Only the Kurds can protect Kurdish rights.
A sad observation and the feeling that history's repeating itself.
Well, here now with me to discuss the implications of that ceasefire for Syria's Kurdish population is Mohammed Salih, non-resident senior fellow at the Philadelphia-based Foreign Policy Research Institute and an expert on Kurdish affairs. Thank you very much for speaking to us on France 24 today on Middle East Matters. Could you please start by outlining the main elements of the ceasefire agreement for us?
Well, the ceasefire managed to achieve a cessation of hostilities between the two sides, and that was really very important at the time, and it was a major source of relief for Kurdish civilians in the northeast, in the Kurdish majority parts of Syria. It also brought about some sort of a formula, even though not very specific and to some extent vague, for the integration of the military, security, and administrative structures of the Kurdish majority parts of Syria into the new Syrian state institutions. And there has been some progress ever since. For example, a Kurdish governor has been appointed for the governorate or province of Hasaka, and there has been an entry of a limited number of Syrian security forces into the Kurdish majority areas, and they are working in coordination and cooperation with the Kurds in those areas. And the ceasefire also granted the security control of the Kurdish majority parts of Syria, also known as Rojava among Kurds, to the Kurdish forces as a matter of priority.
And how would you say that the majority of Syrian Kurds feel about this ceasefire deal, or is it too simplistic to suggest there's one overriding sentiment?
You are right in that. I would say the majority of them are not fully pleased and happy about what happened in January. But given the military setbacks on the ground that the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, sustained mainly as a result of the larger-scale defection of the Arab units of the SDF, the ceasefire at the time was really seen as a major, positive development, because the alternative to that would have been quite likely a very bloody, protracted conflict that could actually also evolve into some sort of ethnic Kurdish-Arab conflict in the long run, and that would have created a lot of bad blood and precedent. So all things considered, the ceasefire really represented some sort of a middle ground outcome for the Kurds, whereby they did not lose control of everything. They also did not have the same level of control anymore after the ceasefire as they did, for example, up until early January this year or late December last year. So in that sense, it was, some sort of a middle ground outcome or scenario that saved some of the gains that Kurds had achieved over the years, but, was not really in any way or shape or form optimal for the Kurdish population in Syria.
I'd like to talk for a moment about some of the protections included in this ceasefire deal for Syrian Kurds. The deal includes the protection of civil and educational rights for the Kurdish people and also guarantees the return of the displaced to their areas. Are Syrian Kurds sufficiently reassured by those promises?
No, not really. And the reason is, because the new government and its military forces have, committed, for example, massacres against other minorities in the past, in the Alawite majority areas or in Druze areas. And the current government is not really a representative or a democratic one. It's not even really a participatory government in a meaningful sense. So all of that really makes people, the Kurdish people on the ground in Syria quite doubtful. But again, given everything that was happening in mid-January, the ceasefire and those kind of protection that are being put there, represent some sort of progress, especially in the wider historical context of how the Syrian state has treated its Kurds. And historically, the Kurds have been always second-class citizens, really, within the territory of the Syrian state. They have been deprived of their cultural and linguistic rights. In fact, their culture and language was criminalized and rendered illegal for a very long time. So again, there needs to be a lot of steps that need to be implemented from here on in order for the local Kurds in Syria to be able to really trust the government of Syria and its rhetoric about being serious about building some sort of representative and pluralistic Syria.
Of course, we are only a few weeks into this ceasefire, but what, as far as you know, will concretely change going forward for Syria's Kurdish population?
Well, they will no longer have the same degree of control that they had over their, local affairs, over running, for example, their security or their administrative affairs. A major setback could be really with regard to the use of Kurdish language, both in terms of daily governance, but also in the educational system. We have to keep in mind that the Syrian Kurds went from a community that was, the subject of major discrimination by the Syrian state up until 2011, 2012. They went from that status to a community that was, overnight found itself in charge of its own affairs. Kurdish became the main language of education and governance for many local Kurds. And so you have had a generation of Kurds really who have been brought up, under those kind of circumstances. So going back now to a status similar to, their parents' experience with the state, with the government, where their language, their culture, and any forms of the manifestation of Kurdish culture and identity potentially be criminalized or not allowed to be exercised in the way that this younger generation was used to over the past 13 or 14 years. That would be really a major setback. However, having said all of that, all hope is not really lost. And we saw that also during January, that the concerted response, unified response by the Kurds in the region all over the world and their allies in places such as France, in Washington, really, came to force the Syrian government and its regional backers to make some concessions. And it led, to some sort of change in the U.S. Position vis-a-vis the SDF and the Kurds as well. So sustaining that level of pressure and ensuring, that diplomatic work continues at the same time that this integration process with the Syrian state is happening, that can really produce some positive outcome in terms of expanding the framework of rights that the Syrian state is willing to grant Kurds, and also to ensure that the Syrian state would be really bound by and committed to and implement the agreements that will be taking place.
Mohammed Salih, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Mohammed Salih, non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, also an expert on Kurdish affairs. Thank you very much.